Well, thank you for joining me today for the broadcast. I'm going to be continuing on my series on marriage matters. And today I'm going to be discussing boundaries because boundaries are very important in all of our interpersonal relationships. Boundaries, we're probably more familiar with boundaries than actually defining the term by with property boundaries, where, for instance, if we have a property and we know that everything on my side of this boundary belongs to me and I can do with it as I wish, everything on the other side of that boundary belongs to someone else and they can do with it as they wish. And I'm going to discuss this in areas of the various areas of boundaries that we have in our lives, physical, emotional, and actually sexual as well. And be discussing those because I'm going to also show why it is important for us to have those boundaries. Because if the only way that we're going to feel safe in dealing with other people, whether in marriage or even in any other circle of friends or any in other interpersonal relationships, is if we can maintain safe boundaries. Because the boundaries are what's going to set a perimeter of where my life my life ends and yours begins, where my space ends and yours begins. Probably one of the best ways of describing that is that we have walls around our homes for the very reason of keeping the outside out and the inside in. I can also illustrate this with when you're speaking with someone, just having a conversation, and you're standing around talking. And how many of you have ever experienced when somebody just kind of they move in just a little bit too close, and you kind of just step back? Now, what you've just done is you've stepped back to maintain your safe zone or your safe perimeter inside your boundary. When that other person got just a little too close to you, they actually trespassed your boundary, and so you step back so you can actually recover that boundary and feel safe. Because it's only well, we're only going to feel safe in the areas where we are within our boundaries. And of course, as our families increase and as our ability to interact with others increases, that boundary can be enlarged to include other people. But I'm going to be speaking primarily today in today's broadcast on marriage and the need to have those kind of a personal relationship, or personal boundaries rather, in our relationships, because ultimately, a boundary establishes this is me, this is what is mine, this is what I protect, this is where my safety is, and that on the other side of that boundary is where your safety is, and that's what you protect. And so this is what I'm going to do is I've got my notes here in front of me on my iPad, so I will be looking down and reading some of these because it's it's really really important. But a lack of boundaries in our relationships, even with marriages that's been in long-standing relationships, the lack of boundaries is a major contributing factor to destructive and dysfunctional relationships. Boundaries are about how to have healthy relationships and interactions with others. Now that may seem kind of simplistic, but it really is true. And so I'm going to examine that a bit today, and just to see how we can perhaps be helpful and for you to establishing kind of boundaries that you can live with, that you can appreciate, that you can feel safe in. Without boundaries, we become subject to manipulation, to abuse, to misunderstandings, inconsistency, compromise, and vulnerable to offenses. You see, if you're unable to maintain a good, safe boundary around yourself, then you're going to be like the scripture says, you're like a city broken down without walls. And what does that mean? It means that you're susceptible, you're open to whatever else comes your way. And if you, especially, this is especially if someone has been abused, perhaps in their youth. If you don't feel you can say no to something, you become very vulnerable to other people's actions and interactions with you, their words. You become more susceptible to offenses and abuses of all kinds. This is why it's so important with us being able to say no, because saying no is actually another means by which we establish a boundary, and we say, no, I won't do that. No, I'm not going there. No, you won't do that. No, I won't accept that from you, and that sort of thing. So it's actually establishing a boundary, because if we don't have those boundaries, it makes us more vulnerable to various other offenses and whatever. You see, a person with no boundaries is unable to prevent unwanted intrusions into their safe space. And this often happens in the marriage, where sometimes, especially wives, feel like they can't say no to anything because to their husbands, because they're in some kind of a servant-slave relationship, which is not really a marriage at all. That's an agreement. That's an arrangement. It's not a marriage. Because in a marriage, as I've said before, we are equal partners of each one of us giving 100% to the other and for the well-being of both of us and for our family. So establishing a personal boundary is very, very vital because this is where we create our own safe zones. Now, boundaries are not walls. It doesn't mean that we can't talk to someone across or through that boundary. It just simply means that it doesn't mean I'm walling you off completely. It simply means that I have a space that is my safe space, and I'm not going to allow you to violate that safe space. That safe space can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be spiritual, and it can be sexual. I'm going to deal with all four of those areas because those are the four primary areas for having individual boundaries. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. But walls protect us from those, as I said, those what may want to violate us or abuse us in any way. They protect us because it's what establishes a parameter of where I end and where you begin. And if this is broken down, then there's no distinction between what you can do or what I have to receive, or vice versa. It's something that we need to have that personal space. And this is also very, very, very true and important in a marriage, because we become interdependent upon our spouse, but at the same time, we don't want to become so interdependent upon them and so dependent upon them that we can't function in and of ourselves. Having a boundary means that I can be my own individual person who is married and has a good relationship with my spouse, but I do not become a non-entity or a non-person. Even though my spouse and I have become one, and we are the Millers, that doesn't mean that I cease to be existing as Eli, or that Marty ceases to exist as Marty. We still maintain individuality, but we have chosen to come together to establish a unit, and in that unit, even as we come together like that we have that unit. But even around that unit, there's a boundary. You're not going to tell me how to raise my children, for instance. You're not going to tell me what I can do in my home. That's the boundary that's established around the marriage and the sanctum of that marriage. But at the same time, even within that, each one of us individually has to have a boundary where we feel safe, where we can say no, we can say yes, we can make decisions based upon what we feel is best for our own interest. And so this is really, really important. With a natural boundary line, or like a property line, the neighbor can look across the fence, and he can see what we have going on, but he can't say, "Oh, you need to plant a garden there, or you need to change this over there." No, it's none of his business. That boundary line says that belongs to you, this belongs to me, and that's the way it is. And so that's really where I want to go with this. And we must have boundaries for our souls and our personalities, and because there are limits to all those areas. And so if I don't have a boundary, then I'm just becoming a doormat for you to treat me in any way you choose to treat me. But when I can maintain my healthy boundaries, and I can say no and mean it, that creates a safe place for me. And as I said, in the years that we've done counseling, one of the areas that we found with people who have been abused physically or sexually in their formative years, they have a very difficult time in being able to establish personal boundaries to where they can say no and mean it, because as they were growing up through the abuse areas, they learned that they could not say no. They had to take over whatever was coming their way from an adult, and it's just wrong. So as we define some boundaries, as I said, there are basically four types of boundaries. There are physical, sexual, emotional, and spiritual. These four boundaries I'm going to just very briefly look at, because this is really the foundation for all of our boundaries and everything that we have. And so this is why it is very important to understand. Physical boundaries means that I have the right to determine where, when, how, and who is going to touch me. I have the right to determine how close someone is going to stand next to me. This is what it said. We've all had occasions where we've just backed off a little bit for somebody that was getting a little too close. That's a physical boundary being violated, and we need to be able to do that in order for us to continue to feel safe. Sexual boundaries is I have the right to determine with whom, where, when, and how I am going to be sexual. And that is really important. Again, that's where many children's boundaries have been violated, and as a result of that, they often become promiscuous, and they come into adulthood. They become very immoral, and they don't have the ability to really say no to something, and so they become tossed to and fro in everything coming down their way because they just have not learned that they can say no and mean it, and that's really, really important. Now, number three is emotional boundaries. What I think or feel or do or don't do is more about me than it is about you. Conversely, what you think and feel to do or don't do is more about you than it is about me. And this is why it's so very, very important that we respect each other in a marriage. Because what might be fine for me might not be fine for you. And I need to respect your boundaries as my spouse, just like you need to respect mine as the spouse. And so this is just simple mutual respect. It's accommodation for each other. We're not ever to violate each other's conscience. We're to be protecting each other's conscience as we grow spiritually, and as we come into the place and into the personhood that God designs for us to become. Now, fourthly, our spiritual boundaries, wherein I have the right to think and believe as I do. I need only face the consequences of my own thinking. You see, I'm not responsible for your way of thinking, and you're not responsible for my way of thinking. That's why we can disagree on opinions, but I don't have to try to change your opinion to meet my criteria, or I don't need to forfeit my opinion to accommodate your criteria. No, no, no. You can think and feel the way you choose to. You're responsible for those way of your thinking. I am responsible for my actions and the way that I have thought. So these are basically the four boundaries that we have that we actually perhaps unconsciously have established. But today, as I said, I'm going to break some of these down to where we can perhaps get a better understanding of them, and then also as a result of that, we can feel safe in our environment. We can feel safe in our relationships. And I'm not talking just about the marriage relationship, but especially the marriage relationship, but I'm also talking about any other interpersonal relationships that we might have. So when we allow a person access to be inside of our boundaries, it's really a gesture of trust and intimacy. We choose to allow that person in. And you see, that's really what happens in a marriage. When we make a commitment in marriage that we're going to love each other, we're going to be committed to each other till death do us part. When we have done that, we have allowed that person access to within our boundaries, and we've opened ourselves up to them. We've opened ourselves up physically, we've opened ourselves up emotionally, we've opened ourselves up sexually, and hopefully as we work together, we can also be on the same page spiritually, because that's also very, 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 very important that we have that. And so going forward now, it says boundaries are for protection from the emotional or physical assault of others. I demonstrated that when we back away from someone who gets a little too close. Sexual assaults are violations against all four boundaries, which is the reason healing and restoration is often so slow and painful. Sexual violations are probably some of the greatest emotional, physical, and a whole being violations that one can experience. And unfortunately today, there are so many people that have been violated sexually that there's no wonder why that society is in the place it's at, and why immorality runs rampant. Is because so much violation has taken place over the years, especially since the 60s, when we had the sexual revolutions and the restraints were thrown off and all of that, and people became liberated, and therefore anything goes and feels good, do it was kind of the word of the day. But I'm going to give you some indications of healthy boundaries, and then I'm going to also contrast some of those with the boundaries that aren't very healthy. But indications of healthy boundaries are these. It's an appropriate trust of others. You see, if you know you have the ability to maintain your own personal space, then you can begin trusting other people, and you can actually, as I said, you will allow other people to come into you within your boundaries to the degree that you feel safe. You won't allow somebody else in voluntarily if you're not feeling safe with them. You'll try to hold them out. You try to establish a wall. You want that boundary to become a wall, so they cannot get past that. But if you have a healthy boundary, you have an appropriate trust of others, and not only that, you're able to reveal a little bit of yourself at a time. It doesn't mean that you just throw everything wide open and says, "Here I am, just come in and take advantage of it." No, no, no. You can reveal yourself a little bit at a time, and this is actually true in a marriage. My wife and I have been married for over 58 years, and we still are finding out things about each other. And that's good. That's the way it should be. That's healthiness. That's growth. That's when we're growing together. We're maturing together. We're appreciating each other. We're learning from each other all the time, and that's really important for us to do that. So I would really want to encourage that. Having a healthy boundary in deciding whether a potential relationship will be good for you. You know, so many times I've heard people come to us and over the years, and they say, "Well, God told me I'm supposed to marry this person. I don't really care for him, but God told me I'm supposed to marry them." I'm going to tell you something. God never tells you to marry this person if it's not going to be good for you. God is he's not an ogre. He is not somebody who is a sadist. He's not one who's going to try to violate you. He's not going to hitch you up with somebody that's not going to be good for you. You have the right to make that choice. You have the right to say, "This is my boundary. No, I don't think this is going to work, and so therefore we're going to have to part company and go our separate ways." That's a healthy boundary. Healthy boundary. Noticing when someone else displays inappropriate boundaries. We notice that. You know, if you've got a good, healthy boundary, it won't take too much time or effort for you to see when somebody doesn't have a boundary. They become very open to a lot of things that they shouldn't be open about. They're letting people in too close. Sometimes in a group setting, you know, you can look at that and you see some people. They say, "Well, they're just a little bit loose. They're just a little bit too comfortable." That just is an indication that they don't have boundaries. You can be comfortable with people with whom you trust. You can be comfortable with people with whom you have opened your boundaries to, but you got to feel that you're in a safe space, a safe relationship, in order for that to really be a safe place for you. Now, saying no to foods, gifts, and touch that you don't want. You have the right as an individual to always say no to those intrusions that you don't feel comfortable with. You need to be able to say no and mean it. Saying no and mean it is one of the greatest freedoms and deliverances that you'll ever accomplish in your life. It doesn't take a big deliverance for demonic influence. It just simply means you can say no and mean it. And that's establishing a boundary. Every time you say no, you're establishing a boundary. And don't allow that boundary to be violated by somebody that's more persuasive or whatever. You can say no and mean it. Another boundary that I think is really important is not allowing someone to take advantage of your generosity. How many times do you have people come to you and say, "Well, could you spare a few bucks here? Could you spare a few dollars? I need this loan. I need that loan there. Can I use this tool? Can I just borrow this for a while?" But then they forget to ever bring it back. Set up some boundaries. You want to borrow something? Okay, you can borrow it until such and such a time. Here's what I expect to have it back. Here's what I expect to have it returned. And I expect to have it returned in the same condition that you borrowed it. That's setting up a boundary. That's just simply saying, this is where I say no. This is where I say yes. This is where I allow you to interact within my boundary. This is where I say no more. Can't go there. So those are just a couple of things here that is really, really important in this because boundaries really are an integrated balance of love and limits, grace and responsibility. We live out of the true nature of God, and these kinds of boundaries will help each other ensure safe, more productive relationships, greater spiritual growth, deeper expression of the kingdom life that were needed to transform the church and the world. Now, what I'm going to do next here is I'm going to give a guide for some relational boundaries. I'm going to kind of contrast some of these things that we've learned over the years and we've taught, and it just is Just showing you a bit of a contrast. But with a good boundary, having good boundaries, you feel secure, you feel grounded, and you're able to cope with the circumstances around you. If you don't have good boundaries, you're going to feel afraid, anticipate crisis, and always expect the worst to happen. Why? Because you know that you don't have a boundary, so if the worst is happening next door, it's going to come in and bleed over into your boundary as well, because you've not been able to set up a boundary where you can say, no, you're not crossing into my space, you're not crossing into my safety zone, you're not coming into where you're violating my own personal space. So a good boundary makes you feel secure and grounded, and you're able to cope. A poor boundary, it makes you feel afraid, you're anticipating crisis, and always expect the worst. A good boundary, as I've said, allows you to set limits and say no. But when you don't have a good boundary, you have a very difficult time saying no. It's to me, it's very sad when I see people who have a very difficult time saying no to anything. They become what we call suckers to salespeople. They become suckers to scams. They just can't say no to anything. If it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. Boundaries, you can say no and mean it. Good boundaries allow you to remain true to self and attempt mutually satisfying compromise that respects the needs of others. That's having a good boundary. Good boundary doesn't mean that you have any. Does not mean that you don't interact with other people, but it means that you have a mutual respect for that interaction that's going to create that's going to add to the well-being of each of you. A poor boundary and not having a good boundary means that a change of behavior, plans, or opinions to pacify someone without holding your truth. In other words, you're just going to change. You're going to be just kind of wishy-washy. Whatever somebody else wants, you're going to acquiesce to that. I've often said, and I've said it in this series, and I'll say it again this time, the difference between peacemakers and peacekeepers is very distinct. Peacekeepers attempt to keep peace through compromise. Peacemakers make peace through reconciliation. Big difference. You are not called to be a peacekeeper. You are called to be a peacemaker. Make peace through reconciliation. How are you going to be able to do that? The only way you can really do that is if you have good boundaries. Good boundaries means that you can be flexible and accountable and expect others to also be flexible and accountable. Without the good boundaries, you make excuses and exceptions for a spouse's behavior, even when it is inappropriate. So if your spouse is doing something that's very inappropriate, and you say, no, you should not do that. That is wrong for you to do that. You've got a boundary. If you just kind of go along, you're afraid you can't say anything because of the repercussions that you're going to receive after the fact. That's not a good boundary. That's where you need to learn to address conflicts, address differences of opinion, address issues, resolve those so they can have growth opportunities rather than creating conflict that breaks down the marriage relationship. Very, very important. Good boundaries mean that you can feel clear, decisive, and act to get what you want and need. You've got a boundary. This is what I need. It's a little bit like negotiating for a price for something. You know, sometimes you go to a store and you say, man, that price is just ridiculous. It's way out of line. And now you can either say, well, I'm just going to buy it anyway, or also you can say, look, is this the best price? Can you negotiate something with that? A bit with that. I like to negotiate. I'm a negotiator. I tell people I come from a long line of horse traders, and so because of that, I like the dialogue. I like to negotiate with things like that. But anyway, if you don't have a clear boundary, if you don't have those, if you're unclear about your choices, your preferences or opinion, you often wonder if you're right. And this is where having boundaries really helps you to come to an understanding of who you are, where your limits are, and what you have to offer, and what you will accept from other people. So when you have good boundaries, you'll be in touch with your own needs, emotions, feelings, and attend to them with self-nurturing. In other words, you're going to do things to actually improve your own abilities and how you relate to your spouse, how to serve their needs, how to love them, how to show appreciation, etc. But if you do not have good boundaries at all, then you're more focused on the partner's needs, emotions, and feelings than you're on your own. And see what that happens when that happens, it creates a great sense of dependence, which ultimately is going to be destructive. What happens if you're totally dependent upon your spouse? What happens if that spouse suddenly passes away? And you haven't learned to be your own person. You haven't learned to establish boundaries for yourself, but everything you do and say is always related to how you react and how you relate to your spouse. And if that spouse is suddenly taken away, where are you? Who are you? Do you really know who you are? Boundaries will help to establish you as a person. So you, in your personhood, you have limits, you have understandings, you have abilities, and you can hold to those and feel like you really have value to other people because you have value to yourself. You know, Jesus said this. He said that we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. He did not say love your neighbor instead of yourself. Now, when I say love yourself, I'm not talking about being narcissistic. I'm talking simply about agreeing with what God says about you. And as you agree with what God says about you, you become secure in what He says about you, regardless of what anybody else says or thinks about you. But you have to have a boundary to where you can live within that boundary, to where you can be your own person. And the stronger you are in your own personhood, the greater abilities you're going to have to interact with others and be a help and a blessing to others around you. If you're continually dependent upon someone else for your identity or your well-being or your whatever, and if that person is suddenly removed, who are you? You don't have an identity because you have not set up boundaries. And now suddenly you're vulnerable and open. And this is where people are taken advantage of so easily. Don't do that. Establish some good boundaries. If you have a good boundary, you're going to be willing to experience temporary frustration or pain as an accepted part of growth. Okay, so something's not going right today. It's not going the way I thought it should go. I accept that because I've got a boundary. I've not allowed that boundary to cause me to change who I am or cause me to respond adversely to that circumstance outside of that boundary. If you don't have a good boundary, you avoid knowing the truth in an attempt to avoid pain. You see, I know a lot of people, especially in today's society, they don't want to hear the truth about what's really going on. I've talked to people and I said, do you realize what's going on with the agendas that are coming down the street, what the Great Reset's all about? I said, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear that. That's just too painful. I'm too afraid to hear it. That doesn't change the truth of it. So again, with boundaries, you can hear things that are adverse or contrary to your well-being, but you're not going to allow it to affect you adversely because you've got a boundary set up to where that's your safety zone. So those are some of the things that are very important for us to have and to maintain in boundaries. I'm just going to kind of summarize this with a note that I have here. It says, allowing others within our boundaries is a gesture of trust and intimacy. And in doing so, we make ourselves vulnerable. You should not allow yourself to become vulnerable to anyone that you have not allowed inside your boundaries. You should not do that. Only allow yourself to be vulnerable to those that you have entrusted to come close enough to you that they can come within your boundaries. We will either experience affirmation or we will be wounded in the process. That is, if we allow other people to come across our boundaries and make us vulnerable. Boundaries offer protection from the emotional and physical assaults of others. I've covered that in this broadcast, and I hope I hope this is being helpful for you. Healthy boundaries allow us to experience a comfortable interdependence with other people, resulting in a general functional relationship and a positive self-regard. This is the reason why it's so very vital to have good boundaries, is because really it's for your own emotional and spiritual well-being. Because unless we have those boundaries, we won't feel safe. We won't be able to love others as we love ourselves. We won't really be able to actually grow into the person that God intends for us to be. because we're constantly in a state of vulnerability. And because we're in a state of constant vulnerability, we're always on guard. We're always expecting the worst. We're always resisting what's coming toward us, even if it's good. We resist that because I can't say no. I have to accept whatever you send my way. And that is no way to live. That is not the way God intended for you to live. Jesus even demonstrated this when the disciples were saying, Lord, you should go to Jerusalem and be crucified. He said, get behind you, Satan. You do not understand the things of the Spirit. He said that to Peter. He established a boundary right there, even with close friends. You need to have boundaries even with your closest friends. And especially you need to have boundaries with your spouse. That doesn't mean that you're secretive. It doesn't mean that you withhold information. It doesn't mean that you attempt to live separate lives. It simply means that you will not allow your conscience to be violated. You will not allow yourself to be violated because of some kind of perceived needs that your spouse may have. And on the other hand, you will not violate them because of your own aggressiveness or whatever. You will respect their boundaries. You will respect their emotions. You will respect their conscience. And together, you'll grow into that unit that your children will appreciate and want to imitate. And you can be an example of what God intended for marriage. I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast. The Lord bless you and keep you, and we'll see you next time.